first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the Museum of Liverpool with the fantastic views across the river behind you, but please face this way during the event. I hope we're interesting enough for you to continue to do so. My name's Ashwin Kumar. I'm Director of Research and Policy at the IPPR, and today's event is a joint event organised with the Centre for Social Justice, and it's funded by Independent Age. So thank you all for coming, and today's theme is poverty. We have seen lots of evidence across the country, whether you want to look at the data, you want to look at the usage of food banks, or you want to look at reports from teachers about their experiences in schools. We have lots of evidence of the problem of poverty in the UK. And Labour has talked about it in its manifesto, in many of the speeches made by people by ministers. And so the question is, what is Labour going to do about poverty? Now, we are, before we start, what I'll do is I'll just introduce the speakers. We are waiting for Stephen Timms, who's the Minister from the Department for Work and Pensions. He's on his way and will be joining us shortly. But for now, I'll start with the panel who are here. So first of all, we've got Henry Parkes, who is a principal economist at the IPPR and a former economist at the DWP. Okay. And then we have Sarah Ogilvie, who is Director of Policy, Rights and Advocacy at the Child Poverty Action Group. And you've previously worked for the TUC, is that right?
I have, yes.
And then we have Joanna Elsom, who is Chief Executive of Independent Age. And then finally, at the end, we've got Sophia Warringer, who works for the Centre for Social Justice and previously worked for Ian Duncan Smith. Okay, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. If you can keep it towards the 5 end of the 5 to 7 minutes, that will be great. And shall I ask Joanna, do you want to start?
Thank you very much indeed, Ashwin. It's lovely to be here. I'll stand up so that I can see you all and you can see me. So my name's Joanna Elson. As you said, Ashwin, I run a charity called Independent Age. We're a national charity, and we are about ending poverty in later life. And it's great to be working with colleagues across the age ranges, because we all want to end poverty across the board, don't we? We think that, and I think you would agree with me, that it is a scandal that there are 2 million people in the UK over 65 who are in poverty, and another million hovering precariously above that. And I think there is this sort of narrative out there that all older people are, living their best lives. They've paid off their mortgage, they're off on a cruise, and, good for them if they are. But actually, there is this group that we all need to worry about, and I think I'm sure we'll talk about the winter fuel payment shortly, but that debate has shone a bit of light on these older people, many of whom are choosing whether to eat or heat, are living in the dark, in the cold, in winter, because they can't afford to do anything else, and we want to do something about that. So on your chair, you should have this little leaflet, and it's got a map on it, and what that shows is that map shows that everywhere across the UK, between 14 and 20% of people over 65 are in poverty. So here in the northwest, you can see it's at 18%, something we should all worry about. Now, what we do at Independent Age is 3 things. We provide information and advice. You'll see at the back there's some of the leaflets on some of the things we do to older people in financial difficulty. We fund charities across the UK, around £5 million this year, to reach people we can't to get the help they need. And then we use the evidence and the stories that we gain from those activities to have meetings like these, talk to politicians, the media, get the message out about ending poverty in later life. So I wanted just to touch on 3 policy areas. We think of policy in 3 buckets, I think, at Independent Age, affecting our groups, and that's income, costs, and housing. But first, just a quick word on the winter fuel payment, because I'm sure that will be of interest to everyone here. So we, like others, are concerned at the decision that's been made, not concerned for the wealthiest of pensioners, who I'm sure will do fine, but concerned for the poorest. And I think the debate that we've all heard played out has made it really clear that there there are currently 880,000 households of older people who are not receiving pension credit, which would allow them to receive the winter fuel payment. We're working with the government to increase take-up. It's great that the government is prioritising that, but we do know from looking back across years and decades that actually that's a very difficult dial to shift. And so pension credit is, I think I'm right in saying, has the lowest take-up of any income-related benefit at 63%. And despite efforts that have been made to shift that, it's been difficult to do so. So we do think that there is still time for the government to shift their position on that, and we would urge that that is looked at again for the poorest pensioners. But let me just briefly then touch on those three policy buckets that I talked about: income, costs, and housing. So on income, first of all, we think there needs to be a proper look at the adequate income of somebody over 65, because it's a complicated picture out there. The government is currently doing a review called the Pensions Review of Private Pensions. That's a great thing. I was talking to the Pensions Minister, Emma Reynolds, about that recently. We'd like to see that widen, not just to look at private pensions, but to look at the state pension too. So we're looking across the board at the income that older people receive and working out what's an adequate income. Because we do know, don't we, from those debates about the triple lock, it's great that the government is keeping that it's not a perfect measure, and whenever there's a debate about it, I think we could probably agree that there is more heat than light generated. But you can't move away from that until you have a real good look at what the income is needed and ensure that everybody has that. So that would be the first point on income. The second on costs is that there's an awful lot you could do on costs. We have been talking to Miata Farnbuller, the new Consumer Energy Minister, as part of the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, about social tariffs for all of the utilities. Because if you had a consistent social tariff that people on the relevant benefits could access, people knew about, that would make a huge difference to the experience of both the people we're here to serve and people in poverty across the board. And then the third thing is housing, because for us, the scandal, the shock really, is that so many older people are now living in the private rented sector. So it's gone up from the 2001 census found 280,000 older people in the private rented sector. That went up to 330,000 in the 2021 census. And it's gone up again since then, experts tell us, and we are worried. Research we did earlier this year said that if nothing changed, that figure would go up to about 2 million by 2040, so about quadrupling in that time, and that obviously has a big impact on poverty and later life. So it's great to see that the government has started down the route of the Renters' Rights Bill. It's great to see some of the protections in there around rent, around quality. We think there's some more that could be done. For instance, we're concerned that older people, not just older people, anyone, is often asked for 6 months rent up front. That's a very difficult thing for people to find, and we think that the bill could look at that too. So there's more to do there. So perhaps that's enough to set us off, and really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Ashwin.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's now a great pleasure to welcome to the stage Stephen Timms. I'm sure Stephen needs no introduction to most people in the room. Not only are you Minister for Social Security and Disability right now, but you've previously been Minister for Pensions at the DWP and Chair of the Social Security Select Committee. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Would you like to speak next?
I'll have a go. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And just sort of reflecting on this question of poverty, I was thinking that when the previous Prime Minister, when Rishi Sunak used to be asked about child poverty, he would say, well, child poverty is less now than it was in 2010. Child poverty has been going down, was the implication, and he was referring there to the absolute child poverty figures, which I think actually, towards the end of the Tories' period of government, were even those were going up. But everybody could see that actually child poverty was getting worse. I mean, look at the food banks, what's going on there. Wherever you look, the evidence of that is very clear. But there was an absolute kind of refusal, really, to engage with this topic seriously. And I welcome the work that the Centre for Social Justice kicked off, looking at a different way of measuring poverty. There's the relative measure, which I think is a more helpful one, but there's also now the Social Metrics Commission measure, and the evidence from all of those was that this problem has been getting very significantly worse. Child poverty up more than 700,000 since 2010 on the relative poverty measure. I took the Child Poverty Act through Parliament at the end, towards the end of the last Labour government, and we made a lot of headway on reducing child poverty in that period. That the legislation was eventually taken off the statute book, and we've gone more than back to before we started the improvements in the early years of that Labour government. So what is this government going to do about all of this? Well, first of all, the central task, very clear in Keir Starmer's presentation of our 5 missions, is to get the economy growing again. And if wages in the UK had grown since 2010 at the rate at which they were growing in the 30, 40 years up till 2010, then the average wage would be £10,700 a year more. And if you look at what kind of ordinary working people are earning in the UK compared with what their peers elsewhere in Europe are earning, we're way, way lower. Rich people in Britain are as rich as those anywhere else in Europe, but ordinary working people are very, very far below in earnings terms what their peers are earning. And we've got to make some really major changes to improve that situation. One of the things we've got to do is to sort out properly our trading relationship with the EU, which has been in such a bad state since we left. So there's a really big job to be done about getting the economy itself working properly again. On child poverty, though, we've kind of launched into this very quickly. We set up the Child Poverty Task Force, chaired jointly by my Secretary of State, Liz Kendall, and the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson. They've had a number of meetings already. They're starting to engage with external experts and talking to people outside government about their ideas. There was a meeting last week where some bold proposals were put forward, I think, from representatives in the Northeast. And the timetable is that there will be a strategy. They will produce a strategy by the spring. So we're not wasting time with this. We're getting a move on to provide the direction that's needed. In addition, we're introducing free breakfast clubs in all primary schools. We're creating 3,000 new nurseries. We're going to be publishing before the end of the autumn the Get Britain Working White Paper about what we can do to support and promote people into work if they're out of work. And then there's all the Make Work Pay proposals that we used to call the New Deal for Working People. I think those are going to be really important as well, just to improve the protections for people in work. And that's one of the reasons why that big gulf has opened up between earnings in the UK and earnings elsewhere. Those protections have not been effectively, well, the protections either weren't there, and we'll be putting them in place, or if they were there, they weren't enforced. It's reckoned, for example, about a third of the people who are in work earning the national living wage are actually receiving less than the law says that they should, because there hasn't been proper enforcement around the national living wage. People are entitled to time off work, holiday with pay. A lot of people are not getting that. So that's the background to the proposal for the new single enforcement body to get a grip on making sure those protections that are in place are properly enforced, which they have not been up until now. Now, I very well understand the concerns about the winter fuel payments that Joanna was talking about when I came in, and clearly there is quite a good deal of concern about what's going to happen, not least this winter. I think in time, actually, we may well find that this change will help and will reduce pensioner poverty because it will significantly increase the incentive for people to claim pension credit, which, as Joanna said, the rate of, there's at least half as many people again who are entitled to pension credit who are not receiving it at the moment. We think we can significantly boost the take-up in the short term, not least because of the publicity that has been recently about the means testing proposal. We've said that anyone who claims pension credit up until just before Christmas will then receive their winter fuel payment for this year. Now, generally, those are going out sort of October, November, but we will be backdating payment for those who claim pension credit up until just before Christmas. And we're going to maintain the efforts to increase take-up of pension credit over the future as well. Independent Age has done a great job on this, campaigning about it, drawing the attention of people to their entitlement. But as Joanna said, we haven't seen, if anything, I think take-up in the last year or two seems to have gone down rather than up. And we are determined to do a proper job to draw people's attention to it. And there is this new work that's emerged over the last couple of years with local authorities, because a lot of pensioners who are not claiming pension credit but are entitled to it are claiming housing benefit. And we can therefore identify from the housing benefit records a significant number of people who ought also to be claiming pension credit. And we're going to be on the case to try and make sure that those entitlements are taken up as well. But there's a huge amount of work to be done here. We are determined to make the changes that are needed. It's, Keir has talked about a decade of national renewal. Nobody is pretending these things are going to be fixed quickly. But we are determined that we are going to put these right, that we really are going to, as the last Labour government did, make deep inroads in the far too high rate of poverty we have in the UK at the moment. And what I ask is that we all work together and bring our ideas together to make sure that we do make the progress that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Right, now if I can turn to Sophia, if you'd like to give us a few
I'll follow
thoughts.
the tradition and I'll stand as well. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here. And so for those of you who don't know, the Centre for Social Justice, where I work, is an independent think tank. We look at the root causes of poverty and disadvantage across the UK and put forward proposals on how to solve those issues. And part of the reason why I'm so pleased to be here today is I spent the last 18 months going up and down the country, conducting an inquiry into the state of poverty and disadvantage in the UK, particularly what has changed over the past 20 years since the CSJ was founded. And what we uncovered was a nation of two halves. We kind of called the first part of our report Two Nations, and the second part a United Nation. That was the more positive part. That was the bit with the solutions. And Sir Stephen was very kindly a commissioner on this work, but just wanted to share kind of some findings from that research, and also to say that very sadly that thesis of two nations existing side by side with very different experiences has been proved true, I think, by the social unrest and riots of this summer. And I'm really welcome the new government's energy around tackling poverty. The new Child Poverty Task Force, I think, has put that back on the agenda. And I just want to kind of frame my remarks today about the need to tackle poverty in its fullest term. And I think before, previously, the Labour governments may have put all their energy into getting people over a particular poverty line that is looking only at household income. And then once the person is kind of over that line, saying that they're kind of okay now, but I think actually we've got to look at all the root causes of poverty, which are way beyond just the income in your pocket. And just to kind of explain that on a personal level, if you carried on through those windows and went about 2 miles down the road, you would get to where I grew up, and you might think, gosh, where has her Scouse accent gone? And I know, I promise I didn't suppress it. It might come out later in the bar, but So I grew up in Liverpool, and by all metrics of looking at household income alone, I would have been in poverty, but I was not disadvantaged. I had a great education where teachers that made me do work experience, that made me do public speaking, that made me do volunteering. I had family that was incredibly stable, that I lived in a household where there was no worklessness, no addiction, no drug use, and I was able to, have a high ambition. My parents had a high ambition for me, as all parents do. And I just feel that that kind of, my example encapsulates why it's so important to not just look at the income, which is obviously a very important part of poverty, but is not the whole picture. So kind of three things that I really want the next government to get serious about if they're going to tackle the root causes of poverty. And one is work. It'll be no surprise to anyone that economic inactivity is the buzzword of the day, and this kind of hides hidden unemployment. Unemployment, so 2010s. And economic inactivity, that is the issue that the government has really got to get serious about now. We know there are 9.4 million of those. Some of those, of course, have no requirement to work or are retired, but 2.8 million of that cohort are out of work with long-term sickness. And over 50% of that cohort say they have a mental health condition. That might not be the primary reason why they're out of work, but that is part of their situation. And we know the most deprived have overrepresented cohort of those with mental health conditions. So a survey that the Centre for Social Justice had done of a national poll found that while 13% of the general population defined with a mental health condition, 40% of the most deprived cohort said the same response. And unfortunately, this is going to be a very costly problem if it's not tackled. 10 billion cost to the taxpayer over the next decade, and a further 1.5 billion in lost tax take if not dealt with. So if they really want to get serious about tackling poverty, moving this kind of cohort of people into work where appropriate, obviously with the appropriate safeguards and conditions for those who can't work, they should always be supported. But that will be really key to lifting so many people out of poverty. And at the Centre for Social Justice, we have a one way which we would really like to see that happen, which is moving £6 billion of money from the DWP, sorry Sir Stephen, away from your purse strings, but into the local authorities, local mayors, local councils for employment support and adult education. And it's worked in the Netherlands. They did this, they devolved employment support and adult education, and they saw a 3 times more effective rate of tackling economic inactivity. And it's great to hear from the Minister that this kind of devolving is on the cards, and we really look forward to working with him and the department to make that happen.
In the white paper.
Exactly. And then the second thing that we really want to talk about today is the importance of family and the home life. And I do think that we are not going to see the figures of poverty and disadvantage and all the bad outcomes that we know exist without we get really serious about what happens in that home life. And unfortunately, the UK is a European leader in family breakdown. That is not something that we want to be proud of, but it's something that we can tackle. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that the families in the UK are uniquely fragile when compared to their European counterparts. And just a kind of a frame of how that's changed over the last few decades, 44% of children born at the turn of the millennium will have not lived with both their parents throughout their childhood. And this figure was only 20% in the 1970s. So there is these families are feeling the strain. Family breakdown is more a part of people's life. And unfortunately, the experience of experiencing family breakdown before the age of 18, although obviously not deterministic on a population level as a cohort and not individual commentary, they are twice as likely to experience homelessness, twice as likely to be in trouble with the police or spend time in prison, and almost twice as likely, 1.9 times, to experience educational underachievement. So I think unless we really get serious about trying to reverse some of those family and particularly early years stats, we are going to see disadvantage continue to go in the wrong direction. And again, the CSJ have got some things we really want to see on that, particularly in the early years, a kind of 3-pronged approach, what we're calling family credit, which is very briefly flexible kind of childcare subsidy, so more choice over how you can spend it, a front loading of child benefit to those vulnerable years where poverty is most acute, 0 to to 4, and 100% transferable tax allowance between couples to give them that flexibility to work their taxes as a team. And if taken in tandem, they would be a cost-neutral measure as well, which I think is music to government's ears at the time where purse strings are rightly tight. Finally, talking about crime. So this might not think, okay, how is this related to poverty? But we know that the most disadvantaged are disproportionately impacted by crime, and it's really good to see the government mission of taking back our streets. And I think it's important that that is seen as a poverty-fighting measure, because what has happened over the last few decades is that the numbers on the crime has actually really gone in the right direction. For most metrics, they have gone down, but the perception amongst the people is that it is worse than ever. And this disconnect between the stats and the reality is, the stats and the perception is really important for people. They don't feel safe in their neighbourhoods. And I think opportunity is really stifled when you don't feel like you can reach the end of your street or your neighbourhood in safety. So yes, you might have money in your pocket, you might be over that poverty line, but if you live in a neighbourhood that is ravaged by crime, then your opportunities are really going to be stifled. We spoke to a small charity founder who works with people leaving prison in Teesside, and he described his community as being effectively lawless, and the feeling that the police have retreated. So it's really good to see the government tackling this idea of taking back our streets, and it's important that we see that too as a poverty-fighting measure. So just to kind of conclude there, that really pleased for this new energy and poverty. It's important that it doesn't all get sucked into getting people over a line, although that is important. We need to tackle those root causes, and I think work, family, and kind of crime and safety are three of those that I'd really like to see front and centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. Okay, Sarah.
As Ashton said, I used to work at TUC, so we have to stand up when we talk. That's my training. I'm going to start by talking about the reality of child poverty, which I think we all know, but it's worth just really thinking about what that means. It means 4.3 million kids in this country, each of them with their own different individual experience, of course, but it's with their stressed out, hungry parents who are going without because they're trying to make sure their kids have got everything that they need. It's kids might not be able to have a coat that fits them when the weather suddenly turns rainy. It's about not having those experiences of childhood, like getting an ice cream or going on holiday. But also it's about matters of life and death. The levels of infant mortality are much higher in deprived areas. Life expectancy is accordingly much shorter. We know as well in the education space that it's still the case in 2024 that the strongest indicator of how well a child will succeed at school is their family income. So whether it's about the experiences of childhood that we want a kid to have, or whether it's about that whole impact across their life on their health, on their mental health, on their education, on their family life into the future, this is something we've really, really got to tackle. And there is no denying that the current Labour government, as you've heard, has got a real big challenge to deal with here because things have got so much worse since they were last in power in terms of child poverty. But the truth about child poverty is that it's not inevitable. We know that child poverty is policy responsive. If you do the right things, you can reduce it, and that is actually one of the best things about working on child poverty. There's not many good things about it, but that is a really good thing. And we know that really what works is spending money directly on families. So if you look at the evidence from the previous Labour government, they lifted almost 1 million kids out of poverty by spending the right amount of money on families directly. Even if you look at the COVID response, which we'll talk about another time perhaps, but wasn't particularly targeted at children and families, even the £20 uplift probably was responsible for around 300,000 kids being lifted out of poverty during that time. So we know that if you spend money on families, then you can lift kids out of poverty, and that's a really good thing. But I think it's worth also reflecting a little bit before you think about the solutions by thinking a bit about what is the nature of child poverty and kind of what's inherent about it. And really it's because if you have children, if you know any children in your life, you probably do, they cost money, right? You do just have to buy them things to keep them going. It means that if you are a parent, you have to look after them. So you might not be able to work as long hours. You might have to choose a job that is closer to home so you can pick them up rather than the one that is best paid. It might mean you taking a job that hasn't got the progression so you can see them whilst they're younger. We know that your salary isn't going to change the more children you have. So even if you are in work, having those children means that your resources to spend on them are going to go down accordingly, and that's not something you can really do anything about. And we know as well that it's temporary. You're not going to have your kids with you forever, so this is just a period of your life that you're going through where you're maybe going to need that additional support. So we need to make sure that the responses we have and the way we spend the money reflects that very specific nature of child poverty, which is perhaps a bit different from other bits of poverty that we see. You will not be surprised to hear that at Child Poverty Action Group, we're really, really delighted to see the commitment of this government towards eradicating child poverty. They've got a very bold commitment in amongst those missions to really reduce and end child poverty in the UK, and that is hugely appreciated. And I think I would say that based on the conversations that we are lucky enough to have, I really believe in the good faith and the commitment and the conviction of the political leadership on this issue, and I think that's really important in driving forward change. If you look as well at the missions, I think we probably, it remains to be seen exactly how those missions are driven forward, but there's absolutely no road to delivering those missions without reducing and ending child poverty. It is a simple fact of the matter. So I think all of the ambition and drive that we've got going towards reducing child poverty is, really going to take us in the right place. There are pitfalls, of course, as I said, the really simple, sorry, I'm tapping the wire, the really simple solution to child poverty is that, if you spend money, you reduce it. And we have heard that there's not a great enthusiasm for spending money right now. That is, something we have to be really honest about. We need to not overcomplicate it. So you do need a really global approach to reducing child poverty and recognizing that we have got levers in different places. But we can talk about it being very, very complicated, and it's not. Again, it mainly comes back to money with, lots of other things that are very important, but let's not forget that. And I think as well, I suppose for me, we've been thinking about lots of the things that are different about society since there was a child poverty strategy. And the Secretary of State yesterday said that for her, one of the biggest changes is mental health. And I think that is probably right, isn't it? Our understanding and appreciation and perhaps some of the challenges with mental health have really come on over the past 15 years. And that relates really closely to child poverty and is very closely linked to it. I suppose the thing is trying to work out how you make sure the child poverty strategy focuses on the bits of mental health that are related to that and doesn't try to do everything on mental health. It doesn't try to do everything on education. It doesn't try to do everything in housing. That's just going to be a bit of a balancing act for government, and I think it can definitely be done, and they will have to prioritise these other things in different spaces, but just retaining a clear focus on what we're trying to achieve here is going to be critical. I'll go quickly through the next bit because what I'm going to say probably won't be surprising again. What are we asking government for? I mean, our first priority is that they get rid of the policies that are going to continue to drive child poverty over the next couple of years. And the biggest ones of those, of course, are the two-child limit, which you will know about, and I would put in a word for the benefit cap as well. We don't talk about the benefit cap quite as much, and it doesn't cost as much to get rid of. It's in the millions, which is more than we have, but probably is within the realm of government to find the money to get rid of the benefit cap. And there's not just a moral argument about why every child matters. There's not just the social security argument about trying to link what families get with need and having an amount of money for each child, but also it is just the most cost-effective way to stop child poverty from continuing to rise. I think that's the first challenge for this government. The second thing we would like them to do is to continue doing and funding the things that we know help on child poverty. In the social security space in particular, that is by continuing to invest in policies like child benefit. Since 2010, as you know, there's been lots of cuts to funding, and child benefit has lost 20% of its value. So in a sense, it's not even about trying to give families more, it's just about catching them up to what they've lost out on in recent years. So those are our biggest asks, but also very, very quickly, we'd like to look at universal credit. Of course, the adequacy of universal credit, similarly, the design and function of universal credit. Those are ways to, make things better for families. Then finally, thinking about how do we imagine a future for children that is completely free of child poverty? Once we've stopped it going up, once we've done the things that ensure that families are able to live a life that is fulfilling and safe and healthy for their children, what do we do next? And there's stuff in education, there's stuff in housing, there's so much that we've got the potential to do. And a quick note on education. We talk a lot about the home and about families, and I think that's because it's so important to children and parents, but children spend a huge amount of their time at school as well. So it's really valuable that education is going to be seen as part of this solution, because children spend so much of their time there. There are levers there that you can help with costs that support child poverty, but also we can talk about stigma, we can talk about all those other issues that feed into having this vision for no child poverty in the future. And I think that's, something that we do lots of work on at Child Poverty, and I know the government is looking at it too. And then finally, I think I would just say, a call to people in this audience to, keep being ambitious. We have got this aspiration to reduce and end child poverty here in the UK. It's a bit of a grim day here in Liverpool, sometimes a bit of a grim picture about child poverty, but we know it can be done. The previous Labour government lifted all those kids out of child poverty, and I think it is on all of us in this room to make sure that they do it again, and to hold them to the highest standards on this, which I know they will be looking forward to.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, Henry Parks.
Thanks, Ashwin. I'll also stand up. Yeah, cool. So our work this year, we've been arguing that we need a social safety net which protects people from poverty when they're out of work, and a system of employment support which supports people to move into good quality work when they're able to. But unfortunately, the government has inherited systems which do neither of these things particularly well. In the interest of time, I'm focusing on the former here, but the latter is also really important, and we've got another event later on that, 4 o'clock, so come back to hear more about that. So the underlying architecture that the government has inherited, namely universal credit, actually has potential, I think, to be pretty good. And I'm glad we're no longer talking about scrapping, you see, but instead around a sort of a root and branch review. This is welcome because clearly there's a lot to review. And a lot of room for improvement. But I do think that with political will, the system could deliver on this over time, and I'll just set out a few priorities here. So first, just something more long-term, which has already sort of been touched on adequacy. So really hope that the government will think properly about adequacy. Rightly, there's been this sort of conversation about the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and we support calls for them to be removed. But even before these policies sort of reared their head, we had this situation where the underlying rates of benefit bore no meaningful relation to the cost of being alive in the UK today. There's this great quote I picked out from the Work and Pension Select Committee last year from Professor Stephen Sinclair, and I love this. There has never been a foundation or rationale for benefit levels. They have been uprated to an arbitrary figure that was set in 1946, which undercut recommendations in 1942 that were based on a report from 1936. And I think that's surprising to most people, that there is no kind of real connection between these things. And relatedly, there's still very low awareness from the public about how low these levels actually are. This is as low as £72 a week for a single person. The JRF last year conducted some research with the public, which found that the public generally assumed benefits were too high until they're sort of informed at what level they're at, and then people kind of shift their attitude accordingly. So if we were able to build some consensus on those levels, perhaps through an independent process, then the government would at least have something to aim for over time, and then we could gradually be working towards that with sort of year-on-year increases, with the government having the power to adjust that trajectory as it goes, and we could have a level of benefits in the longer term which would constitute a true safety net tied to the cost of living. And then just on some more immediate priorities, we've got 2 related and genuinely tricky problems in the form of the 5-week wait and benefit deductions policy. Lots of organisations have called for the 5-week wait to be scrapped, and that makes sense. It forces people to borrow money to cover the first month of their claim. It saddles those people with debt. They end up sort of repaying it forever. But it has to be said that it's not sort of as straightforward as being okay, well, let's scrap it. It's not a straightforward choice that can be sort of switched off, like something like the 2-child limit. It is fundamental to the design of UC. That's a benefit that's paid in arrears. It's based on earnings in a calendar month that, from the point at which you make a claim. But we know in many cases people have been out of work for some time when they make a claim. So if we were able to take a look back at the period before the claim started and say, okay, that's the assessment period, then they would have immediate entitlement to benefit on day one, which would leave people in a much better situation. This is basically, I mean, it sounds a bit technical, but it's basically backdating. It already happens in some circumstances on UC. And we've been talking about pension credit. In pension credit, you're able to update backdate a claim up to 3 months. So we sort of have the thinking and we have the systems in place to be able to do that, and that would be a way for us to work around the 5-week wait, potentially. And then secondly, just to say, and sort of a related problem is around deductions. So at the moment, the department can deduct up to 25% of the standard allowance to recover debts, including advances as a result of the 5-week wait. And 25% is pretty high given the overall levels of benefit that we are working with. And actually, they are really quite prominent in the system. And for those people with deductions, they are losing £60 a month on average as a result of them, which obviously is a fair old chunk that they could really do with keeping. So we'd like to see this brought down to 15% over time. And we know, again, this is not a straightforward thing, but a good priority for the government to have. It will make a big difference to claimants, people claiming Social Security, and the cost to the government would be relatively low. You know, yes, they would have to take on a bit more debt. Debt is not free, as we know, but it would be a way of kind of actually genuinely making a difference with fairly low expenditure implications. So 2 sort of short-term things there, 1 longer-term vision, but these are the sort of things that we think the new government should be seriously looking at to improve living standards in this Parliament and hopefully the next. Cheers.
Thank you, Henry. Right, well, we've got about half an hour left, so I want to come straight over to the audience and to hear your questions. So, we have a roving mic, so please wait until the microphone gets to you. If we could start with the person sitting here in a white top. Yep. And I'll take questions in groups of 3 and then get the panel to answer.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Josephine and I work for a migrants' rights charity called Praxis. And my question is, I think some of you will guess what I'm about to ask, but how does the government propose to reduce poverty in this country when we have an immigration system that actively pushes people into poverty by imposing really high direct costs and limiting their incomes, and also makes it really hard for people to get out of poverty once they're in it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for keeping your question short. I did see something on Twitter saying that Chair should impose an 8-word limit on questions. I'm not quite going to do that, but if it does turn into an essay, I might have to stop you. Right, who would like to go next? There's a person in a stripy top there on the right.
Thanks, Ashwin. Fiona from Homeless Link. Homelessness is at record levels, and while it's great to hear about these long-term measures, people want to know what's being done in the here and now, particularly around measures such as local housing allowance that was frozen for so long and is now due to be frozen again next year, and the benefit cap that meant in high-cost areas many people didn't see the benefit of that uprating this year, because if those actions aren't taken in the here and now, those long-term measures will be really quite meaningless.
Okay, thank you very much. And then gentleman here on the front row, and then we'll come to the panel. I'll go to Stephen first because he has to leave fairly shortly.
Phil Hall from SPP, which is the Society for Pension Professionals. Talked a lot about adequacy, storing up problems for the future. 8% minimum contributions is not enough, as DWP have said, will lead to 12.5 million people not having enough money to retire on. Stephen, you were excellent in opposition in saying this was important and you would do something about it. The new Pensions Minister has already said it's not yet a priority. So how can we sort of deal with that issue to prevent poverty in the future?
Okay, so we've got 3 varied questions, one on immigration, homelessness, looking at the LHA and the benefit cap, and then finally pension contributions. Stephen, do you want to go first?
And I'm sort of tempted to answer some of these questions as if I was still the chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee, as I was up until a couple of months ago. I just want to comment on Henry's points about the 5-week wait. I think this is a real issue, and we're committed to reviewing universal credit. Frank Field said to me once that throughout the whole era in which claiming benefit involves filling in a form with a biro and then somebody taking that form in a van to a disused army depot outside Liverpool, the whole time, you got your first benefit payment in 10 days. And now, having spent hundreds of millions of pounds on agile technology, as we were always assured it was, it takes 5 weeks. And you know, I think Henry's suggestion of kind of starting the clock on the 1 month assessment period before people make the claim is quite an interesting idea, and you know, we need to look at. Josephine's points, I mean, I think in a way, you know, that question is one that all the contributions play into. One decision that we have made lately, which I am very pleased we've been able to announce, is the extension of the Household Support Fund, which was due to end in about a week's time. And the fact that the Chancellor announced that, the extension of the fund, and also announced it in enough time for local authorities to prepare for the changes that they need to make in order to carry on, is a very positive indication, I think, of the Chancellor's thinking about this and the priority she attaches to addressing the challenge of poverty. One issue that Praxis has always highlighted has been the problem of people with no recourse to public funds for years and years and years. Again, that was something that we made some recommendations about on the Select Committee, and I'm hoping we are going to be able to make some progress with those. A question about pension contributions. Well, I'm definitely not the Minister for Pensions, although we did indeed make some comments about this on the Select Committee. I mean, I think it is clear that in the long term, paying just 8% combined employee plus employer contributions into a pension fund is not going to be enough. I mean, auto-enrolment has been a huge success in getting a much, much higher number of people into pension saving than were in it before. I think that the kind of dramatic scale of that is sometimes not understood, just how big an impact that's been. And the fact that it was a consensus, you know, the idea came up under Labour, it was legislated for by the coalition, implemented by the Conservatives, the fact that there's been a complete cross-party consensus about it is one of the reasons it's been so successful. But we need to build on it. And given that the cost of living crisis that we've been through has been so acute, I think it is right that that is not the moment to be increasing contributions. But I think the right way forward, and the Select Committee made this point, is to come forward with a plan so that people can see how over time we are going to be able to make the progress that we need. The problem about homelessness, it's an acute problem. The previous government committed to abolish rough sleeping. In fact, rough sleeping has gone up. I mean, in the end, what we have to do is build more homes. There's no way out of that. And, you know, there's really interesting research about how increasing the housing stock in an area reduces the rent that is then charged in that area. And the fact we haven't been building enough homes just means that rents have been rocketing. I think the last figure I saw was that rents have gone up 9% or something in the last year, so way above the rate of inflation. Causing huge pressure on the housing benefit bill, pressure on the local housing allowance, and there's no shortcut. We've got to build more homes, and you'll have heard already quite a lot in the conference about how we're planning to do that. It's not a quick fix, but it's what we've got to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I'll come to the rest of the panel. So we've got 3 questions: immigration, homelessness, LHA benefit cap, and pension contributions. Don't feel you have to answer all of them, but do you want to make any comments on any of those?
Yeah, thank you. I'll talk about the kind of homelessness question, and then also the pension contributions. On the homelessness, I think I absolutely agree with the Minister. It is about building more homes. In rough sleeping at the Centre for Social Justice, we really want to see Housing First rolled out. We know that that was something that this government were looking at. We hope that that comes back as a consideration. I think it's incredibly effective at giving people the stability they need to then deal with the other kind of challenges they're facing. Obviously, I know that is only for rough sleeping, but in terms of wider homelessness, whether that's families in temporary accommodation, again, it is all about that roadmap to 1.5 million. And I know that there are lots of conversations this week about how to get there, but I think there are going to be lots of hurdles along the way, not just in policy, in terms of the planning reform and getting planning through the councils. That is something I hopefully the government is looking at with the bills, but also in things like skills. Do we have the skills? Do we have the raw materials to make this 1.5 million target? At the moment, no. So we need a roadmap for the skills, the raw material, and the planning, all three. And at the moment, the planning is taking lots of oxygen, but I think the skills to get there is also important as well. On the pension contributions, I mean, this is a wider point about the ageing population and whether we can afford to pay for the needs that are coming down the road. And linked to that on the other end of the spectrum is the plummeting birth rate, where we are not at the rate of replacement that is needed to fill the jobs, that is needed to pay the tax, that is needed to pay the pensions. So I think this government will need to get very serious about looking at that demographic shift and how we can encourage and support people to pay for longer lives, potentially not necessarily healthier lives, and the burden that will place on services. So it's a huge question that we can't just keep kicking down the road, because at some point it's going to come unstuck.
Thank you. Joanna.
Just 2 quick points from me. First, on Fiona's point on homelessness, and still, I'm in my late 50s. When I was a child, you saw people sleeping on the streets, and then it went away, and now it's back. You walk down from the station in Liverpool, and it's really shocking, and every city, and of course it's not only in cities. We started hearing on our helpline, older people becoming homeless, ringing because they're homeless. How can they get help? How do you cope with that if you're over 65, you've got health problems, and so on and so on? Really awful. Local housing allowance is an important part of it. Ensuring it's uprated and continues to be uprated is going to be key. And then just on benefits, and Stephen talked about the Frank Field point, just a sort of broader point on this. We hear from people all the time, and these are older people, but I'm sure it's the same across the board. So here's an older person who said, there are benefits available that no one tells you about. Endless hours of filling in the same information just to be told you don't qualify. I'm still not sure that I'm claiming what I'm entitled to. The system seems designed to not let you know what you can claim for. There's plenty to fix there, I think. For pension credit, there are 243 questions on that form to answer. Do we need all of those? It's great that we've got this uptake campaign. Will there be enough people answering the phone if as many people take up the offer as we would like? I was on a phone-in programme the other day on warm fuel payment, and somebody said they kept trying to get through and they just couldn't get through, and they gave up in the end. So I think there's plenty to fix. Yeah, let's work together on it. Thanks.
Thanks.
On homelessness, I would be really surprised if housing is not one of the biggest parts of the child poverty strategy when we see it come out. We actually had a report out last week with Shelter and Women's Aid about the role that the benefit cap is playing in actually trapping children and their families in temporary accommodation. And we saw the benefit cap stats also last week, actually, showing that far more households are now subject to the benefit cap, probably as a result of that LHA freeze temporarily being removed. So, the benefit cap is, it's not the longer-term solution on housing, but it is going to getting rid of it is going to be something that is really going to help children and families in the short term, and allow Parliament to deliver its will that more families can receive the benefit of local housing allowance going up. I completely agree with the point about uprating, of course. In terms of children in the immigration system, we talk about 4.3 million children living in poverty, which shocks me every time I say it. I think it's horrific. Then when you break down into it, there are, of course, groups that the that suffer much more under that, frankly. You know, if you are a child who has a disability or is in a family where someone else has a disability, you're much more likely to be living in poverty. If you are a black child, in fact, over 50% of black kids live in poverty. And of course, children who are in the asylum system are also disproportionately affected. And, you know, I think it is the case, children just should not be subject to no recourse to public funds. There's no way around that. And I really hope the government will move forward on that as well. You know, we would be doing all these children a disservice if we don't focus on the most vulnerable within that strategy too.
Thank you. Henry, did you want to comment on any of those?
Yeah, so quickly on so NRPF, yeah, I think it would be very cheap to get rid of as well. So it's like one of those things, I think it's kind of political rather than fiscal in terms of the scale and the amount of expenditure that will be involved. So I think that's quite important. We've also done some work looking at the effect of NRPF on work incentives. So not having access, for instance, to the childcare element of universal credit, for instance, or not having access to anything but the core part of the free hours offer. So we're actually dulling work incentives at the same time as denying people stuff that they should be getting, and, you know, they're often contributing. It makes no sense at all. On the homelessness question, I'll just briefly on LHA. So I think we're in quite a strange situation now where, you know, I think the government will be expecting to be uprating the standard levels of benefits. I don't think anyone really questions that, really. And yet somehow on LHA, we've now got into a place of will they, won't they? Which I think is a bit odd because it's a departure of the approach that we have in all the other bits of the system, which is generally that we uprate them as costs go up, and the need to uprate LHA, particularly as circumstances change in particular areas, is kind of a principle that we had and was secure, and now it feels less secure, and I think that's a bit of an issue. And then, I mean, so certainly the government committing to LHA at 30th percentile would be good. And then I think overall there is a question about whether LHA is, you know, obviously it was, I think, a bit of an improvement on the previous HB system, but actually is LHA the way forward? You know, you know, even if it's set at the 30th or even the 50th percentile, does it actually do the job as well as it could? But then there is, of course, the longer term point which Sir Stephen's made, which is around housing supply, of course, and that we do, you know, keeping up LHA is an expensive thing. You can see why the government doesn't want to do it, but you know, the pain that it causes is significant. So yeah, obviously, longer term housing supply question remains as well.
Okay, thanks, Henry. Right, time for another round of questions. Who would like to go next? I did take people from the front, so there's a lady in a pink or sort of reddish top. Sorry, I can't quite see at the back.
Hi, thank you so much. Jess Rackham from Royal College of Psychiatrists. Ourselves, along with other mental health organisations, and it's been great to hear so many references to the importance and the relationship between poverty and mental health today. Working with the previous government, however, it never got that much traction, built a mental health policy tool, a low to no cost option that would be used across departments for them to consider in implementing their policies. They'd automatically look, as they're developing policies, whether they were having an impact on mental health. And it'd be great to hear from the Minister whether this would be something that the new government would be interested in as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. There's a lady here in a blue top at the front.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm from Good Things Foundation. I was hoping to have a question answered about the digital divide. There are 2.5 million people who cannot afford the internet, and many of universal credit, other benefits are only available online. So what is the government going to do to fix the digital divide?
Okay, and one more. There's a gentleman here in the middle with glasses.
John Pring from Disability News Service. On economic inactivity, Labour has repeatedly promised over the years that it would co-produce policy with disabled people. And yet Liz Kendall failed to appoint any disabled people's organisations or experts with declared lived experience to the new Labour Market Advisory Board, even though she made it clear the key aim is tackling what she called spiralling inactivity. It's been described as exclusionary. What's happened to that promise that Labour made?
Okay, thank you. Stephen, do you have time to answer?
Yeah. The mental health hub, this is a new one on me. I'd love to see it. I mean, it's not something that's been drawn to my attention. Presumably you have a copy of whatever it was that was drawn together. Please let me have a look, and I'll be keen to do that. I mean, it is clear that a large and growing share of the ill health, which is keeping people out of work is mental ill health. And we need to be doing a better job on supporting people. On the digital divide point, I mean, there is the Help to Claim service, which is delivered by Citizens Advice, which I think does a good job, which people can take advantage of if they're struggling with their claim. I mean, you know, I think the digital... You're absolutely right, universal credit is very largely online, and there are significant benefits from that. In terms of the administration benefit, but also in terms of people having access to information that they need and feedback and comments and so on. The number of people who are excluded from that, I think, is shrinking, but there is still a significant number there. And at the moment, it's really it's the Citizens Advice Service, which is the best way, I think, to provide support. If you think there are specific things that we might do beyond that, then I'd be interested to hear about them. On John's question, I mean, we've got a manifesto commitment to put the views and voices of disabled people at the heart of everything we do. That's what our manifesto says. And it's my job as the Minister for Disability with a cross-government responsibility, not just a responsibility in the DWP, to deliver on that commitment. So I've had a number of engagements already with disabled people's organisations. I went to Scope at the Queen Elizabeth Park the other day. They co-chair the Disability Charities Coalition. We had a very good discussion with that coalition. Scope and not a... Oh, right, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, tomorrow I'm with the Voluntary Organisations Disability Group. But I'm very keen to talk to anybody, and it's my job to do that, and to make sure that there is...
Let's not get into a back and forth. Stephen's kind of answering your point. Go on, Stephen.
Yeah, it's my job to make sure there is a proper dialogue between disabled people's organisations and us, not just about DWP policy, but about policy across government as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm conscious that you'll have to go soon.
Yeah.
But other members of the panel, we've got mental health, digital divide, and the co-production of policy specifically with disabled people. Anybody want to come in? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Just on the mental health question, thanks so much, Jess, for that. I think so important that you're thinking through this lens and love to chat more. We're doing a big project halfway through at the moment looking at what's happening in the mental health kind of diagnosis. And I think one thing that we've come across is that we have surveyed all the NHS trusts to ask them what do they mean by mental health or what do they mean by mental ill health. They all mean different things and some of them don't have a definition. So this has become a very kind of nebulous term which has big benefits. People are more aware, people are more taking it seriously, and there's resource going into it, but it has also in some ways slightly muddied the water about what is actually meant, and that those people with really acute needs are sometimes getting lost in the more kind of well-being conversation. So that's something that we are looking at there. And I think also in that there is a tendency because mental ill health and physical health rightly are given, or the ambition is to give them parity between the two, there is a rush sometimes to have a medical solution to what is becoming a more social need. So I think a lot of the drivers of mental ill health, particularly in young people, are about their environment, their home environment, their school pressures, their social media, and therefore a simply medical route is not going to change the circumstances that they are in. It may help them get their head above the water, absolutely, that's the first step, but it's not necessarily going to help them recover fully. So we're looking at how that kind of social need can be met with a social response alongside the medical need as the medical response. So hopefully that will be something we can continue a conversation of afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Joanna?
Can I just pick up one, which is Hannah's very good point about the digital divide? I think there are some broader themes here, which really are about what service is it we are offering people and how are we going to offer that? So there are some people who simply can't use digital. And so every service, whether it's public or private, needs to find a way to take account of that. But also, heartbreakingly, as you said, Hannah, there are people who turn off their broadband because they can't afford to pay for it. We've seen that with older people. We gave some evidence to the Women and Equality Select Committee earlier this year, who I think were fairly shocked to find that older people, many older people are perfectly well able to deal digitally. And of course, then you get both the financial inclusion benefits, but also the social benefits of being able to link up with your friends and family at low cost and so on. So it's heartbreaking when people have to make that choice to turn that off because they're prioritising their heating or their food. So I think we need to see this problem in the round and work together on how to fix it. Social tariffs will be part of that. There are many social tariffs that are linked to benefits, but people don't know about them. So again, we've got a big job to play to make sure those social tariffs are both consistent and well known about.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to talk about digital divide as well, both in terms of kids and their parents. During COVID, our cost of the school day work, we heard a lot from kids about digital divide, and it was about families not necessarily having a laptop, not necessarily having one for each kid who needed to work on it, but it's also about kids not having, an environment in which they can work, so perhaps not being able to pay for the electricity, perhaps not having a room for every kid to be in a different place. And I think it's just a really good way to think about thinking about the full circumstances in which a child exists and how poverty affects all those different parts of their life, and then that knock-on effect on education. And we haven't actually spoken about employment support very much today, even though we know it is going to be the subject of this white paper and a really big drive of activity for the government. We did a pilot about 18 months or so ago about supporting second earners in a household back to work. So normally mums who had been at home looking after their kids and wanted to get back into work. And the things that we learned about that were the things you would expect. The barriers that you can reduce by listening to what parents need and giving it to them, you can deal with that really easily. And one of the barriers was that so many job applications, you can only fill them out on a laptop, not on a phone, and people were used to using their phones. So by giving families a laptop, that was a really simple way to enable people back into work. So just kind of thinking about, lots of these solutions are about listening to parents and really responding to their needs in a practical way. But then, the other thing we found through that pilot was that there are these big, massive structural barriers that really can only be changed by kind of quite a fundamental rethinking of what you ask for parents in an employment market. And I guess I'm just hoping, and I'm sure it will, but really hoping that the white paper links up with the thinking on the child poverty strategy, because how parents can work and what they need to work, and also the support they need so that they can also have some time at home with their kids is all joined together, really.
That's a really good point about employment support and employment. We have a fringe meeting specifically on employment and social security this afternoon at 4 o'clock in this very room. So do come back if you're interested in that. Henry.
Yeah, just quickly on the digital divide. So, the Jobs Centre Plus did trial sort of access to free broadband for job seekers. I don't know where they got to with that, but I remember talking to people about it, officials about it, it was sort of like, it was still a bit of a hidden feature of the system. So, there needs to be more of a proactive conversation going on in the job centre about both access to the internet and then, as you've just mentioned, access to devices, because basically, good luck applying for a job if you don't have the internet or a laptop, and doing anything on your phone is extremely frustrating, we all know that. Both access to devices and the internet, extending that trial and proactively engaging with the question, because we did a project probably about 2 years ago now, where it came up enormously all the time. It's like, I'm expected to do X, Y, Z, how on earth? And that not being addressed in the conversation that happens at Job Centre Plus level.
Okay, we're coming towards a close, and we've only got 5 minutes left. We do need to finish on time because I believe that there's another one in here at 10:30. So I'm just going to ask each of the panel members, just having heard the discussion, heard some of the questions, heard Steve and Tim's answers, any final thoughts? But you've each only got a minute, so please, very quickly. Any final thoughts to say?
Yeah, thank you. So I think this has showed us how complex the issue of poverty is. All the questions have pretty much been on a different topic that shows you how many fires the government has to be fighting all at once. But I think what the tendency is to fight the fires, and what the need is to get to the root causes. And we know some of the drivers of poverty, things like worklessness, things like family breakdown, things like debt, things like poor health. Unless we get on serious about tackling the root causes, we're always going to be firefighting. And I know that argument to Treasury is very difficult to make when it's about kind of investor-save measurements. But we would love to see more of that metric coming into the Treasury thinking, so that it's not just about returns within one spending cycle, it is about returns longer down the tracks. And I think that's one of the only ways we'll see real shift on this. So yeah, getting back to tackling the root causes, I think will be something that there is time, hopefully, in this Parliament to do, but it needs to be done at the beginning.
Just one extra thought from me. I mean, I think we've seen, as you said, we've ranged far and wide, but also we've seen some real agreement on some of the issues, and there are some powerful organisations in this room that need to continue to work together. 70 of them signed our call for an older persons commissioner. We have one in Wales, we have one in Northern Ireland, we don't have one in England and Scotland. What the one in Wales achieved a couple of years ago was to increase the uptake of pension credit, which we've talked about, by over 25%, using her convening power. So there's a lot to do, and I would urge you, if you haven't seen that campaign, to get behind it. I'm going to leave you with one quote from an older woman called Michaela, who said, "I think it's absolutely crucial that people's voices are heard, particularly the older generation, as we've been brought up not to make a fuss, and actually we've got to."
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah?
So we think that the cost to public services over a year of child poverty is around £40 billion annually. And I think we could probably go around in circles trying to, doing a bit of a chicken and egg about where starts and where things finish. But I am absolutely confident that if we sorted out the money question first, if we make sure that families have got enough income and we kind of stabilise things, then the scope that will give us to address all these other issues about mental health, about housing, about bigger structural questions, I think that will flow from it much more easily than it would do from the current position we're in. And I hope that's what this government will do.
Okay, Henry.
Yeah, just to say, I suppose it seems like there are a lot of problems here, right, and a lot of things to work through. And just the fact that some of them, I think there are some quick wins, and there are some things that we should be doing sooner rather than later. Whether that's sort of 2-child limit, sorting out the 5-week wait, making sure people have access to the internet. I think the pension credit uptake stuff is very inspiring because that makes such a big difference. And there is also this long-term vision, and these problems need to be looked at properly before we start to approach them. And just to make sure that we are working and thinking on both levels at the same time, and not just be like, oh, it's all awful, which sometimes it can feel. And just to make sure we don't lose sight of those kind of early wins that we might be able to get in this Parliament, for instance.
Okay, well, it just leaves me to say thank you all for coming, and can we thank our panellists for some really interesting thoughts.